Here is an orange ink by Kaweco Sunrise Orange.
Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink. The paper I'm using here is a Maruman Mnemosyne Notebook.
I already realized that at the beginning I wrote Sunset Orange, but it is Sunrise Orange. A really great orange ink, and it's super affordable in price. I think Kaweco makes great inks for the most part, and this is absolutely one of their better ones. This does have a little bit of tone variation by pen, but not huge, so it doesn't seem like you're using a completely different orange ink. It does shade, kind of. You sometimes have to search for it, though not very often. So generally, orange inks, I prefer to not have any kind of shading. Yet, this one, I think, does a very nice job, and it doesn't detract from it for me as an orange in any way.
The pen for today is a Diplomat Arrow. All of the writing samples are done with
a Retro 51 P51 with an extra fine nib, a Retro 51 Corsair with a medium nib, a Retro 51 Lincoln with a 1.1 stub.
Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there, starting with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Looking at the extra fine nib, we get weird very beginnings on the TH of that. Just ignore that first word. It corrected itself rather quickly. No feathering and no spread. We do get shading, and I kind of like it. Like it on the first, or so the second line. You see that the top of the L and the E are a little bit darker than the rest of the word. Same with T on it, a little bit darker. Now, a majority of this seems to come through mostly as a single tone, but words in themselves are a little bit darker. This is a slightly drier writing pen, and even with that solid, great orange, very happy with what I'm seeing. Looking at the medium nib, it is a little bit darker than it was with the extra fine. We get no feathering and we get no spread. We do get some shading, not just on the edges of words. Look at edge on the on the second line. The top of the D and the E are both a little bit darker than the rest of the word. Word on the first line is in general darker than edge was. Now the W starts a little darker, it lightens up at the OR, and during the D it starts getting darker. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium. It has no feathering, it has no spread, it has better shading in how it's coming through. Oh, brother. Look at better on the second line. I bet you thought I was going to say brother on the first. Better on the second line. Starts a little bit darker. It lightens up during the E into the first T. Second T darkening, lighter at the E, darker at the R. We did say brother, so look at brother on the first line. That starts darker, lightens up at the RO, darkens at the TH, light at the ER at the end. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle.
This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelican M1000. Here is the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There was approximately 5 milliliters of ink left.
The next writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter's Notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering and we get no spread. We do get some shading that I think shows a little bit nicer than it did on the Clairfontaine. Look at that on the first line. The T is a nice mid-tone. The H gets darker. The A and most of the T gets lighter. Cross of the T a little bit darker. There's definitely some shading that can be had here. The drier pen is defeating a little bit of it. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than it was With the extra fine, a little bit darker than on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we do get some shading, and you can pretty much choose. I mean, just looking at all of the writing, there's tons of it. More is darker as a word than kindly right next to it on the first line. Kindly starts a little darker on the K, lightening up in the I through the N. The D starts to darken just a little bit, and it's got a great sunset look to it. At the L, Y starts getting darker. Looking at the stub nib, it is a little bit darker than it was with the medium. Bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering and we get no spread. As far as shading, you might have chuckled when I called it sunset type shading on the medium, but you won't chuckle when I call it a sunrise type shading. Words. I'm going to leave this in. Chuckled. I tried so hard. Sometimes you just miss. Look at chuckled. It's beautifully orange, lightening up out of the H into the U, lightening still to the C, starts working its way dark on the KL. I say dark, it's darker. Lightening up at the E to the D, but the D becomes much darker itself. Himself starts dark, works its way lighter through the middle of the word, darkening up at the LF at the end. Really very nice sunrise shading. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting it into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, I was really expecting this paper to change up the tone a little bit, and it didn't, showing this is a rather opaque ink. It is the same tone as the Clairfontaine. Now, we get no feathering, we get no spread, we get no shading on this paper. This is where I do think the tone of the paper affected what could come through. Really, nothing. It's just there. I would prefer it on white paper than yellow paper. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than it was with the extra fine. A little bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread. There are a couple of moments of shading that come through, just a light seasoning, if you were. The nailed, the D is a little bit darker. The wari skin, the W, and the kin at the end are a little bit darker. The T of butt is a little bit darker. Not a ton, though, just really only a little bit. Looking at the stub nib, it is a little bit darker than it was with the medium, darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. There is no feathering, there is no spread, there is shading, taking you on the sunrise journey on the second line. Second line, third line, I can't count. Numbers, it's not really numbers. Journey starts darker at the J, really works its way gently, easing up in tone all the way to the R and E, where it's at its lightest but very easy to read, and then all of a sudden gets much darker at the Y, really showing some nice shading. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it looks a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Strange, I know, yet just a tad bit. Only the slightest bit. You wouldn't notice without them being side by side. No feathering and no spread, which is no surprise. There is shading. I think the shading is coming through a bit nicer here. Look at Promised on the second line where it starts just a tad bit darker. Lightens up at the beginning, or through the middle, the SE, a little bit darker, lighter at the beginning of the D, darker at the end of the D. Offer on the first line is darker on the O. The tops of the Fs are darker or lighter than the bottom of the Fs. Pretty nice what's going on. I just think the shading shows nicer than it did with the Clairfontaine. Looking at the medium nib, it is just a little bit darker than it was with the extra fine. Same tone as the Clairfontaine. There is no feathering. There is no spread. There is shading that definitely shows itself better than the Clairfontaine did. Look at Journey. Starts as a nice darker orange with the J.R.R, but at the knee lightens up except the downswoop of that Y. Forest on the second line is a nice, mostly monotone. Something else we can really notice here is the vertical lines aren't really cutting the ink, not breaking it up. It's not being distracting. This is pretty good for using on quad rule paper. Looking at the stub nib, it is just a little bit darker than it was with the medium. So a little darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. There's no feathering. There's no spread. Possibly better looking shading than it was with the Clairfontaine. Look at Possible on the second line, where the PO is a nice mid-tone. The S's lighten up a little bit. It's at the B where it gets very dark and lightens up just a little bit with that L. Very dark at the E once again. It seals the deal here. Look at Sealed. There's so much tone shift that it would be ridiculous to describe it all in the very subtle back and forth. Looking at the back of the page, there's no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Diamine Sunset. Here is Robert Oster NG Special. Here is Sailor Gentle Apricot. Here is Zenzoi Juicy Orange. The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine, a little bit flatter in tone. The vertical lines match with this. You can still see them. This is not like the primary thing you could use here, but using this instead of a red in this kind of a situation, I think could be acceptable. There's no feathering, there's no spread, there's no shading. There is a very consistently performing nice orange on the page. Looking at the medium nib, it is just a little bit darker than it was with the extra fine, little lighter than on the Clairfontaine. There is no feathering, there is no spread. Can I tell you a secret? There's a little bit of shading going on that's not too bad. Let's look at his secrets on the first line. His starts darker, gets lighter all the way through to the S. Now, Secrets starts as a nice mid-tone, lightens up at the RE, and gets very dark at the TS at the end. Looking at the stub nib, it is just a little bit darker than it was with the medium. We get no feathering. We get no spread. We would be getting some shading. Look at wood. For one, if you look at they right next to that H is very dark. It's like it's angry. Wood starts as is generally a nice mid-tone. The L itself darkens up a little bit. Not bad looking at not right next to it. Again, mostly a mid-tone, but that T darkens up just a little bit. Just like the T darkens up on Forest directly underneath it. Looking at the back of the page, just as we would expect, we have no problem with bleeding or ghosting, so it is a good ink for a student to use.
While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here is a blue ink by Diatramentis Pigeon. Here is a brown ink by Diamine Tobacco Sunburst. Here is a green ink by KWZ Green Grass. Here is a purple ink by Tag Kayonaoto Sakura Nayumi. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does feather, it does spread. I do find the amount of feathering to be slightly distracting, not entirely distracting. But it's just a little bit. You see it in dark and dangerous and difficult. Funny that it's on those words. Now, there is tiny moments of shading that are going on. Typically, we've been seeing some paper or some inks do better because of these drier pens on the copy paper, so I have pretty good expectations here. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the extra fine, a little darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. There is no feathering and there is no spread. It's copy paper. There is feathering and there is spread. Look at though it may be passed and gone. It's all got feathering all over it. Now, the spread that's going on, it is not taking it all the way up to a broad. It's kind of like a medium broad, meaning this is not too bad in what's happening here. Write a bit larger than I am, and you're probably okay. But I try to write at what I think would be a more or less normal size for on this paper. I think it was much better with the extra fine than with the medium here. Looking at the stub nib, it is darker than it was with the medium, darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. We do get feathering, lots of feathering, growing everywhere. Look at grows, that first word there. Fit is having a fit with the feathering. Yes, it does spread. Now, disgusting feathers aside, I don't think this is horrible. It's just that you can't put all those disgusting feathers aside. It does shade. You see it in Fit, in Wild Things. It's there. It's this ink is very good in that drier fine on this paper. The medium and the stub, I wouldn't. Looking at the back of the page, you can see how the ink did get deeper into the page. It's not fully ghosting through. I would not write on the back because I feel like I would lose a bunch of the information with the spotting back and forth. However, nothing bled through touching the page underneath.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink? The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper.
The extra fine is dark enough to have no issue reading it, though a full page may be a bit much. The medium is just the tiniest bit darker and does shade better. Now, the stub is the same as the medium, and I think the shading shows off much nicer. As I mostly use orange as a second color on the page, editing, adding things into notes, things like that. For me, the medium flow, medium nib was really great. And another great option in this would be a slightly wetter, fine nib. Great tones, great shading from both. And I think you get to really exploit all of the best aspects of this ink.
I hope you got something out of this video, and thanks for watching.